today we're going to be talking about discerning the spirit of truth and love. And the first thing to say about discerning truth is that to discern truth, well, you kind of have to discern what the lies are, right? Does this make sense to everybody? We live in a culture of lying. Okay? So a recent article in Psychology Today did some research on how much we lie. And one of the things they'd done this research in the 1980s, and they found that really in the 1980s we were greedy people. Greed was the thing that we did. But in the 1990s, there was this sharp increase in lying. And we get movies like Liar, Liar that came out in the 1990s that sort of show us that this is something we were talking about as a group of people. But you know what? The studies show that lying didn't stop in the 1990s. In fact, lying increased. And today, studies have shown that everybody lies, and everybody lies a lot. And when people are asked questions kind of under the cover of anonymity, they'll tell you, well, yeah, I lie to my spouse, or I lie to my boss, and it's not just that, but we live in a culture that encourages us to lie. So we live in a lying age. We are encouraged to lie to our bosses so that we look better. How many magazines talk about that? Yeah? Put on that show. We're encouraged to lie to our extended families just to make our lives easier. Lying to both of my mother-in-laws. I have two. It's hard. We are encouraged to lie to our partners. We're encouraged to lie to each other. Even in these contexts, we are encouraged to lie to each other. And sometimes we feel that push that we need to do that. The problem is that sometimes we think about lying, we think of it as blatant. Like, if I saw a lie, I'd know it. But lies are actually often really subtle. And the truth is often very complex. And because of that, sometimes it's hard to know what's a lie and what's the truth. And this is not something that we just came up with in the 1990s or now. This is something that has been a question for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. In fact, yay for us, Jesus, Paul, and John all talked to us about this issue that they were experiencing in their own churches. So what is our goal today? Our goal is to talk about how we can tell God's spirit of truth from the spirit of lies all around us. And so I am going to have us focus on sort of two main questions. So now I'm going to give you the overview of the sermon, everybody. You can just listen to this part, then you can go if you want to, because, I'm just kidding. That's a joke. Okay. Two questions we're going to talk about today. First, how do we discern between the Spirit of God and the false spirits of lies that are around us? And two, based on that knowledge, how do we live and worship together here? And so I'm going to give you the two answers that I've come up with from my time. The spirit of lies is consistent with the world's perspective. So what the world wants is what the spirit of lies wants. Whereas the spirit of truth, which we also refer to as just God's spirit, is consistent with Christ. With who he was and who he is, with what he did and what he does. So sometimes we try to figure out, well, what is the spirit like? We're lucky. We actually had a guy walking around among us who was living like the Spirit. Okay? And so, that was my other little joke. All right. We live with love. So what do we do based on this knowledge? Once we know how to discern the spirit of truth versus the spirit of lies, what do we do with that? Well, we live with love as our primary goal. So when we come to worship with each other, we're focused on everything that God is doing. This way? Okay. Not just on seeing miracles. Seeing miracles, absolutely important. But we focus on everything that God is doing. Two, we live in humility like Christ. So we don't seek power for ourselves. And we'll talk a little bit about the slippery slope of seeking power versus seeking power for ourselves. And we seek to be in healthy relationships, not just to be right. and we seek to serve others, encourage what God has in them, rather than to focus on our own calling or our own ministry. So I'm going to talk to you about all those little pieces. But how do we start this? Well, we're going to talk about 3 key biblical passages that help us to understand what is the Spirit of truth. And I mentioned before, kind of gave you a little teaser, that 3 really pretty big names in Christianity, Jesus, the Apostle Paul, the Apostle John, all tell us about who the Spirit is. So we're going to take a little time and look at what they said. So hopefully that'll help us to understand. So we're going to start by talking about a passage where Jesus is talking to his disciples just before he dies. This is in John 14. And we're gonna talk about what does Jesus say about who the Spirit is that's going to come to them. Then the next passage we're going to talk about is in 1 John 4, and we'll hopefully get all that up. We're going to be talking about the Apostle John and how he talks to his struggling community in Ephesus. And then third, we're going to talk about what happens when there's a divided community, and Paul is trying to talk to this divided community in Corinth. And what does he say about who the Spirit is? We're going to say, what do all 3 pieces of this have in common with each other? Okay? So as we're listening to this, I want you to think about, what is this saying about the Spirit? Okay? So this is Jesus talking. I am telling you these things now while I am still with you, but when the Father sends the advocate, that's talking about the Spirit there, as my representative, that is the Holy Spirit, he will teach you everything and will remind you of everything I have told you. I am leaving you with a gift, peace of mind and heart. And the peace I give is a gift the world cannot give. So don't be troubled or afraid. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Other direction. So John 14. So what's going on in John 14, the passage that we just read? So Jesus is saying goodbye to his disciples. He knows he's going to die. And so he's passing on really important information to them. So Jesus describes the Spirit to comfort the disciples because they're about to be in mourning. Does that make sense? That Jesus, as he's about to die, wants to make sure that his disciples know that there's someone coming to comfort them? Yeah? Okay. That's to me, very exciting to see that Jesus, that's the love that he has for his disciples. So what does he say about the Spirit of truth? And we didn't get the whole passage. If you go and look at all of John 14, it says a lot about the Spirit, but we picked a little part of it. So what does he say? He says the Spirit of truth is our comforter. In other words, sometimes it's translated advocate, sometimes it's translated comforter. The word in Greek is paraclete. Para meaning like beside somebody. So it's basically, a paraclete is somebody who walks alongside you, who's sort of there to advocate for you. And I mean advocate not in the sense necessarily in a trial situation, but like we advocate for children. We advocate for the elderly. We advocate for those who don't have voices. This is what the Spirit does for us. He stands beside us, comforts us, walks alongside us, and gives us a voice. Okay? And the Spirit of truth is how God makes his home in us. It was interesting that Jose was commenting on stuff we'd mutually read. One of them was St. Julian Norwich, who, her writing is beautiful. She has this place where she talks about that Christ and the Father and the Spirit make their home in us. And that because of that, we have what she calls homely love. Love that looks like the home that we are a part of. Okay, especially for some of us who've had homes that were not great homes, to know that this is how the home is made in us. It's kind of exciting. Jesus connects the Spirit with the peace and love of the Father. So what the love of the Father looks like and the peace of the Father, that's what the Spirit looks like in our lives. And Jesus connects the Spirit with obeying his commands. And I love what Jose said earlier about the law of faith. Today I'm talking about the command of love. Okay? And what's interesting is the word command here is the same word that's used all over the place for, what are the famous commands we are often talk about? Anybody? Famous commands? The 10 Commandments? Same word. This is a command. It's not like it would be nice if you loved each other. This is the new command Jesus gives. In John's gospel, he was very clear about it. I give you a new command. You're going to love each other. The way I loved you, you're going to love each other. And so what does the Spirit look like? Well, the Spirit looks like obeying that command. So let's now move on to John the Apostle and what he says. And again, let's look at where's the Spirit and where is love in this, all right? Dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. Because many false prophets have gone out into the world. You, dear children, are from God and have overcome them, because the one who is in you is greater than the one who is in the world. They're from the world, and they speak from the viewpoint of the world, and the world listens to them. We're from God, and whoever knows God listens to us. But whoever's not from God doesn't listen to us. This is how we recognize the spirit of truth and the spirit of falsehood. And the very next verse, dear friends, let us love one another. For love comes from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Whoever doesn't love God doesn't know God because God is love. This is how God showed his love among us. All right, you ready? How did God show his love? He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. This is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. Dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us. This is how we know that we live in him and he's in us. He has given us of his Spirit. So what does his Spirit look like? It looks like us loving each other. So let's go to the next one. So what is the situation that's happening here? So why is John saying this? Well, John is saying this because there is this crisis happening in this Ephesian church. Both internally, they're struggling, and externally, people have come in. These false prophets have come in, and they're stirring up the people against each other. And John's response is to contrast the spirit of truth from the spirit of lies. And he gives this sort of list. How do we know what the spirit of truth is? Well, the spirit of truth comes from God and looks like Jesus. If it doesn't look like Jesus, not the Spirit of God. The spirit of lies comes from the world and looks like the world. So if something, we're trying to figure out, is it the Spirit, is it not the Spirit? If it looks like the world, it's not the Spirit. This means the Christian community is joined together by a united spirit, and that spirit mirrors God's sacrificial love to us. That's how we know that we are really his. We know that we are Christians when we love like Christ, the way he loved. And that's what the Spirit of truth helps us to do. So if that wasn't enough, we're going to move on to what Paul says, okay? And I've taken a very large section and condensed it down. And this is actually the main parts of 3 chapters. So this is actually, if you went and read all of 1 Corinthians 12 through 14, you'd get the full impact of this, but I'm giving you the little pieces that connect the chapters. Does everyone follow me here? What connects 12 with 13, 13 with 14? Okay, you're all on my page. Awesome. Okay, it's always good, because I talk fast, so I want to make sure everyone's on the same page. All right. So, again, let's think about what does it say about the Spirit? What's it say about love? All right? Cool? Okay. Now we are the body of Christ, and each of you is a part of it. And God has placed in the church, first of all, apostles, second, prophets, third, teachers. And, I could be going like this as we're going through, that these are all the people we got here, right? Then miracles, then gifts of healing, of helping, of guidance, of different kinds of tongues. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Are all work miracles? Do all have gifts of healing? Do all speak in tongues? Do all interpret? Now eagerly desire the greater gifts. Oh, hold on a minute. There's a greater gift than all the ones you just listed, because those are pretty awesome. Yes? Okay. I will show you the most excellent way. If I speak in tongues of human beings or of angels, but I don't love, I am a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy, I can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and I have faith that can move mountains, but I don't love, I'm nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give even my body over to hardship that I may boast, but I don't have love, I gain nothing. Love never fails. Where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. For now we see only a reflection in a mirror. Then we will see face to face. And in the ancient world, when you were going to greet someone, you would come up to them and you'd be like face to face with them because you'd give them a kiss. Really, sometimes it actually says mouth to mouth, like the kiss that you have, that intimacy. Then we will see face to face. Now I know in part. Hold on a minute. Did Paul just say he only knows in part? That's interesting. Then I shall know fully as I am fully known. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Follow the way of love and eagerly desire the gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. So what's happening here? 1 Corinthians 12 through 14. So in Corinth is one of those big cities where everybody likes to come in. Everyone likes to show off how great they are. It's a rich city. And so people like to kind of compare themselves to each other. You know, you have this thing, but I have this thing. Yes? We all know this kind of thing? Yes? We live in a seaport city where it's really diverse and where people like to compare each other. Yes? Okay, that's Corinth. Actually, I make it a joke in my class that Corinth is like Vegas, like in terms of its promiscuity and all this other stuff. So I'd be like, what happens in Corinth stays in Corinth. But that was actually what Corinth was like. And so Christians in Corinth were no exception. They wanted to know who was the super awesome, powerful Christian. And everybody else was secondary. So their goal was, if we can get to the next slide, they said the spiritual gifts was a sign that you were a super Christian. I'm going to say it again. They said the gifts were a sign you were a super Christian. Yes. But Paul's response to this was to not let them say that. His response was to say that while the spiritual gifts are absolutely necessary, and he spends a long time talking about how important those gifts are, but they're not to be lorded over each other. It's not, I have this gift and it's better than your gift. Or I have a gift and you don't seem to have one. Because it's not our power, it's God's. And God's Spirit's purpose is to unite us, not to divide us. So it's not about who has power and who doesn't among us. We all have God's Spirit, but it shows itself in different ways in all of us. So what's Paul's response? Love is primary over everything, including God's spiritual gifts, which are pretty awesome. He says, we only prophesy in part. We only know in part, not fully. Which is kind of important because they really thought they had it all together and it was all there right now for them. Everything. And his clarification was, no, you don't have everything. You got a lot, and that's good, and keep using it, but it's still partial. We're still waiting for it to be full. And we need to get our relationship with each other straight in order to use God's gifts correctly. If we want to know how to use these gifts that we've been given, which are amazing gifts, we need to figure out how to relate to one another. So this leads us to, and I'm going to take us to the next slide, what we can get from these three main passages about the Spirit. So what does the Spirit not do? We'll start with the negative, okay? The Spirit is not, for us, about seeking power or attention. Spirit does not give us a claim to be super Christians or have a power ministry that we claim as ours. Okay? If God is working in power, it's because God is working in power. And he doesn't give us full knowledge of God now. And he doesn't look like the values of this world. So I think I should seem smart. Okay? Not a value of the Spirit. I think that I should be a leader. Not the value of the Spirit. I think that I should look better than others. Also what the world thinks and not what the Spirit's doing. And if we see division in the church, that is not coming from the Spirit. Because the Spirit's goal is always to unify us. So what does the Spirit look like? Well, it looks like he, I'll use he, although technically you could use he or she for the Spirit, or I just don't like it, because it is sounds like not a person, okay? So the Spirit looks like the Father and like Christ. The Father gave his Son as a sacrifice for us. So we know something about how the Father loves, right? The Son died as a sacrifice for us. Again, we know something about the Son. We know something about Jesus, right? Which then tells us, what is the Spirit like? Well, the Spirit's love looks like this sacrificial love. So when we love each other, it's going to look like that. The Spirit, thank God, acts like a comforter and someone who walks alongside us. The Spirit does give us knowledge. It's a partial knowledge, but we are given knowledge by the Spirit. And the Spirit is demonstrated by how we love each other. It's God made known among us, which is kind of exciting. And a little bit of a big responsibility, but a beautiful, wonderful responsibility. So how do we struggle with the Spirit? So that takes us to our next slide. And I'm going to say what the Bible has to say about that. Sometimes we seek the Spirit for what we can get from God. And all the things I'm about to list are not necessarily bad things, but it's when we seek to get them from God. Okay? Miracles, power, being right, having a calling or a ministry. None of these things are bad in themselves. I mean, it's actually good to be right about what we say. It's good to have a ministry. It's good to have God's power among us. And it's good to do miracles. Yes, everyone's following me. The problem is that the spirit of lies can use each of these things so that we get in the way of what God is actually doing. And I'm going to go through and basically say, how do we avoid that? So what does the spirit of lies do with looking for miracles? Well, first of all, it says that miracles are the only sign of God's presence among us. Are miracles the only sign of God's presence among us? No. Is it one of the signs? Yes. But is it the only sign? Are there other ways that God can do things? Yeah, absolutely. Jesus actually critiques the Pharisees when they come to him and they say, give me a sign. I want a miraculous sign. He says, the only sign I'm going to give you is the sign of Jonah. And in this particular passage, a lot of times Jonah is a reference to resurrection, but in this particular passage, it's really a reference to the transformation, the amazing transformation, conversion that happens among the Ninevites. And so he says, I'm going to show you by watching people's lives change. That's my miraculous sign to you. Is that the miraculous sign they wanted? No. But is that an absolutely valuable and important miraculous sign? Oh, yeah. What about power? Well, when power becomes the goal of seeking the Spirit, sometimes it becomes the goal rather than learning from what the Spirit has to teach us or experiencing his transformation and his love. So is it wrong to long for God's power to be here? No. But it can get in the way of us seeing all the other ways the Spirit works and moves. Jesus didn't come in power. He let go of his power. So sometimes when we want God with the Spirit's power, sometimes we miss the fact that the Spirit can come the way Christ came in our lives. And that we can can be full of the Spirit, and it can look like being completely humble and giving up power. And that's what the Spirit can look like among us. So that is what we often think of as the one way that the Spirit looks in us. But this is actually what Jesus looked like. To go to the next one. So what does the spirit of lies do when we want to be right? How many of you want to be right? I'm going to be honest, I want to be right. I'm a person who I train like my brain for a living for I said 100 years. It was really like 15, but it was a long time. I like being right. This is something I struggle with a lot. But when we long to be right, sometimes we long to be right more than being righteous. And what does righteous mean? Righteous means being in a right relationship. In a right relationship between us and God, and in a right relationship with each other. So with that big word righteous that we often associate with good deeds is really about how we relate to each other. In being right, there's my little funny, I'm right, you're wrong. In being right, we seek our own reputation when we get stuck on that, right? But we sometimes miss the needs of the person who's right in front of us. What about our calling? What does the spirit of lies do when we focus on our calling? Well, when we seek our calling and that becomes the focus of everything that we do, we lose the focus of loving God through serving others. Focusing on our calling can mean missing opportunities to encourage the gifting that someone else has. Because we're so busy looking at what's my calling? And right next to us is somebody who's got God doing great things with them, but they don't see it in themselves. And they're sitting around going, what's my calling? And we're all just standing around going, what's my calling? When we could be looking at each other and say, Denville, I see this calling on you. But we're so busy looking at ourselves, we miss it. Again, is it wrong to have a calling or to ask God for a calling? No. But if that becomes our focus, we miss the opportunity to really love each other by encouraging each other's giftings. Jesus saw God's gifting in those that the world discarded as worthless and unimportant. What would it mean if we did the same? If we spent less time looking for what our calling is and spent more time saying, how can I value the least of these? Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Not blessed are the rich in spirit. The children that the disciples thought were a waste of time, and we're like, hey, leave them alone. Doesn't want to deal with you right now. You're annoying, and you don't really have anything. You're not really going to bring anything to Jesus. Jesus says, this is what the kingdom looks like. So, based on this, let's take the next step. So, what does the Bible say about how the Spirit speaks and heals among us? So when we seek the miraculous over seeking God's presence, we actually miss what the Spirit is actually saying and doing sometimes. And I'm going to give you two examples. So Elijah, he expected God to come in a spectacular way. He was waiting for God to talk, right? He's like, I'm waiting for you. And a powerful wind came by, and God wasn't in the wind. What, God wasn't in the wind? Okay, well, maybe something bigger will come, and that'll be God. An earthquake came. God was not in the earthquake. Fire came. Okay, so we've had a big storm, an earthquake, and a fire, all of these big things that should theoretically be where God is. Yes? That's what we expect here, yeah? For God to be big and loud and do big things? Instead, God's Spirit spoke in a gentle and quiet whisper. And I'm going to say this, if Elijah had left because he didn't see God in any of those things, he would have missed the gentle, quiet whisper. And if he wasn't listening really hard and waiting and saying maybe God will come a different way, he might have missed that gentle whisper. Naaman is a similar story. Naaman expected Elisha to heal him in one instant. And in fact, Naaman had a lot of clout as a person, sort of came to Elijah like, okay, heal me. And he expected it to happen because Elijah had done it before with other people. He had just, done a healing, boom, guy's healed. He tells Naaman, you got to go wash in the Jordan. Naaman's like, what are you talking about? You're healing me right now, right here. I'm not washing in some gross river. But Elijah said, if you want to be healed, you have to go wash in that river. And so, Naaman had to humble himself, get into this icky water, and wash repeatedly, publicly. Not something he really wanted to do, so that God could heal him. Why did he do it that way? Why was it unexpected? Why wasn't it that moment? Because God could have done it in a moment. It was because God had a message for Naaman through the way he healed him. Sometimes when we get so focused on the one way of healing, there's just one way, and it's going to be instant, it's going to be now, we miss that maybe God has something for this person in a different kind of process of healing. Maybe it's going to be over months and months of time and traction, or going to a physician, maybe God's going to use the time to bring people to him. Maybe he's going to use that time to change that person's life and change lives around them. Sometimes we say, well, God didn't heal you, or God didn't do that, because you went to a doctor or you went to this. And the thing is that, honestly, God can do healing in so many different ways. Who are we to limit what he can do and how he can do it? Now, should we ask for him to heal right now in this moment? Oh, yeah. And he will do it many times. But when he doesn't, can we also ask, what are you doing in this, God? I think that that's a valuable thing. So what about when we seek God's power? Sometimes we can miss the transforming presence and love. We can misinterpret what the Spirit is doing in us and in others. We may assume that the only way that God asks us to respond is the same way that everyone should respond. In other words, God told me to dance, God told me to shout. That must mean that every other person, that's what they're supposed to do to show the Spirit. But does the Spirit work the same way in every single person based on what we just read? Does the Spirit look the same way in all of us? No, the Spirit's going to come out in different ways. Sometimes the Spirit's going to come out in quiet reflection, and some people, that's the way God works in them. They'll sit and they'll just be in God's presence. Other people, the Spirit works by making them jump and shout and run around. Okay, that's kind of my way God usually works with me, but sometimes he does work with me in these other ways. Last week, I had an interesting moment where I had this feeling of a word that God was giving me, and I was sitting down, and I was like, okay, what do I do with this? And Ralph said, anybody who has a word, come up. And I'm like, is that your word, God? Like, are you saying to me, I need to go stand up there? And Ralph said it I think he said it 5 times. And I'm sitting here, I'm like, am I being disobedient? And the Spirit just kept saying to me, and I felt like this really strongly voice saying, stay where you are, stay sitting. And I just kept going, and I kept saying to God, it was kind of funny, but the pastor told me to go up there. And God actually said to me, are you going to listen to the pastor over me? Is that the plan? So I was like, oh, hey, okay, you're the Spirit, yeah, okay. So I stayed sitting, and someone came to me and started talking to me about their lives. And I ended up praying for them and having this amazing moment, and the word I had was for them. And had I been up here, it wouldn't have happened. So it wasn't necessarily, God doesn't look the same for all of us. And we see this in 1 Corinthians. Paul talks to the Corinthians about this kind of thinking. We're not all ears. We're not all hands. We're not all mouths. We're all part of the body of God, but we all do things differently. I had a friend who said she was the armpit of God. She's like, sometimes I stink, but, he knows how to love me. We need to build each other up in ways that honor what God is doing, not only in us, but in them. And that means figuring out, knowing them well enough to figure out, to seek God and say, what is God doing in you? Does that make sense to everybody? And the thing about Paul and all of the other letter writers, all the different apostles that write, they always wrote to that situation, to that church, and to the people in that church. And each situation was different. And that's the case here. Now that makes it way harder. It's far more complicated to do that. But does it reflect the Spirit and what he's doing? I think so. I think that it's going to look different in different ways. So what about being right? When we worry about being right, we can misunderstand how much we understand and don't understand about the Spirit. One of the things that we read earlier is that Paul said we only know in part. Sometimes we think that having the Holy Spirit gives us a guarantee that whatever we say and do will be just like God. Which means that sometimes we go up to somebody else and we put that on them. We say, God told me this about you. And we may not know anything about their life, and we may be getting a part of a word and may not be getting all of that word. Now, that doesn't mean that God isn't really speaking to us in that moment. God is probably really speaking to us, but we only get part of it, and it's filtered through us. And I don't know about you guys, I'm not perfect. My filter's kind of, misty and kind of gross sometimes, and I'm sure God needs to keep washing the filter. But to be honest, that filter is always there. I'm always here. I'm always going to see partial. Should I stop talking to people? No. I should just be careful that I don't say to somebody, God said this. This is his word. The Lord, so says the Lord, and I know the Lord. Because what can happen is that sometimes we can really hurt people because they hold that word. And if that word isn't a fully true word, what can happen is they can hold those pieces that are actually the false piece, and it can keep hurting them. So does that mean we should stop? I don't want anybody to stop, okay? I just think we need to be careful about how we do it. And how do we be careful about that? We have a really reasonable way to be careful about that. What do we do instead? We seek to humble ourselves. And we've got a great model for that. Because the love of the Spirit looks like who? Looks like Christ, right? It's not like we have no model for how we're supposed to live this. We seek what God is doing. And we're honest with whoever we're with. We say, I don't always know, and honestly, I'm getting part of a picture. You should test this and see whether this is true. You should see if other people, who's also listening to the Spirit, also see this to be true in your life. Keep saying the words, but with that awareness that, we don't get it perfect. And when we hear from the Spirit, we should do it together. As much as we can, do it together as a community. Because that helps to promote righteousness. Remember that right relatedness? Rather than the rightness. Because what can happen is if I get a word for somebody and they don't think it's the word for them, I can get it insulted. No, God told me that that's my word for you. And then it becomes about being right. Right? Rather than it being about what is God doing. Okay, maybe sometimes I get things kind of halfway right. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Do you see what I'm saying? Everyone follow me? Okay, good. I like the nods. I'm used to teaching where I'm like asking you to answer a question, and yeah, okay. I might ask you to answer a question at some point. No, okay. Paul speaks to the Philippian church, and he points to Christ's humility as a model for how we should love each other. What does our love with each other look like? It looks like Christ. For it is God who works in us to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. God's in us doing things. Isn't that awesome? This isn't supposed to be good news for you guys, right? Okay? God's doing stuff. How awesome is that? And we get to love each other through it. We get to learn from each other. We get to see each other. What about seeking our calling? Seeking our calling or our ministry, we can often miss God's calling on others' lives and how he's actually bringing the kingdom into the world. The disciples asked a similar question. In fact, two of the disciples came up to Jesus and were like, so, what exact role do you have for me? What is the awesome role that you have for me in your kingdom? Jesus' response to them was, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. If we're walking around seeking our calling first and foremost as the first thing that we do, we can miss so much of what God is doing with our sisters and brothers, in our community, because we're out serving. Are we taking the effort to serve someone else? I will tell you that the moments in my life where God has given me clarity for my calling have almost always been moments when I haven't been asking. They're almost always moments where I've just gone and done what he said to do. In fact, teaching for me was one of these things. I told God I would rather eat bugs than be a teacher. I'm serious. I was very serious. I said, I will eat larvae that are in a pan. I will do that. In a foreign country, I will do that. I'm not a larva-eating fan, just so you know. Because I didn't want to teach. I was just like, I don't want to teach. I don't, And God just said, just go serve. I'm asking you to do it. And I wasn't saying, I'm going to go check out teaching because I want it to be my passion. It was like, I don't want to go there. I was running, kicking, and screaming. But God said, serve. Serve for me. I'm going to do something with this. And it became my life's calling. But it wasn't because I was seeking my calling. It's because I was seeking to serve and just to do what God asked. And I honestly believe the moments when I was looking for my calling, desperately looking, I felt like God was silent. It was the moment when I was serving and really looking at other people that God did something to say, this is what you're called to do. So how do we figure out what our calling is? Start serving. Start looking at other people's callings. Start seeking that. So how do we discern the spirit of truth? Instead of seeking only miracles, we seek to see what God wants to do in every aspect of the people's lives around us. Instead of seeking our own power, we humble ourselves before God and before those in our community by loving. Instead of seeking to be right, we seek right relationships with everyone around us. And instead of seeking our own calling, our own ministry, we seek to serve others and encourage their gifting. And one final reminder from Paul. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Follow the way of love and